Hello, and thank you for joining us for this on-demand webinar. My name is Jason Senamore, Chief Product Officer here at SINC, and I'm delighted to be joined today by a panel of IT leaders across Canada, where we'll be discussing a very pertinent topic around accelerating Canada's move to the cloud. Joining me today, we have Alan Legal, the Virtual CIO and Director of Strategy at Ricoh Canada. Hello, Alan.
Hello.
We have Elizabeth Rhodenizer, the CIO for Public Service Commission of Canada. Hello, Elizabeth. Hakan Kutluay, the CIO for Eldorado Gold Corp. Hi, Hakan.
Hi, Jason.
And last but by no means least, Dugald Topshee, the CIO for the Department of Justice Canada. Hello, Dugald.
Hello.
Well, thank you very much for joining me today. As mentioned, we are here to talk about accelerating Canada's move to the cloud. Cloud computing represents a fundamental shift in the delivery of IT services. However, as cloud computing enters its second decade, the move to the cloud still seems to pose many challenges for many organizations across Canada. These challenges are clearly represented by the percentage of companies that are actually yet to take that journey to the cloud itself. I'm going to start off with a pretty straightforward question here, and I'd love to get your perspective first and foremost, Alan, as somebody who obviously communicates with CIOs across the country on a regular basis. Let's start at the beginning. If I have nothing in the cloud, where do I start?
That's a great question, Jason, and thank you for it. As Jason said, my name is Alan Legal. I am the Director of Strategy and Virtual CIO for Ricoh Canada for our customers. In the IT space, we focus on small and medium businesses, so I may bring a different perspective than some of the enterprise CIOs that you have here today. Where do you start? Well, you have to start with a strategy. You have to know and plan this move. If you try and just do a forklift of your existing environment, you're typically not going to get the benefits that the cloud brings. And this is a difficult thing to do. There's so many factors that you need to consider when thinking about moving to the cloud. And by only having that strategy, you can save yourself a lot of time, you can save yourself a lot of money, and you can identify and avoid a great deal of risk just by starting with that strategy. Things like, what services do we want to move? What workloads do we want to move? What are some of the low risk areas, some of the low sensitivity areas that we have? Can those go? Are we going to move all of our services, or are we just going to move non-revenue generating? Those are the kinds of questions that typically I would help our customers ask during a strategy development session when it comes to the cloud.
Fantastic, thank you. Elizabeth, I'd like to come to you at this point. Looking at some of the work that you've obviously been doing with the Public Service Commission of Canada, and obviously, your exposure to just this cloud topic and conversations with your peers across the country about the journeys they've taken in this space. I mean, do you have some experience really on kind of your own journey that you've been going through at the Public Service Commission of Canada, where you started essentially?
Thank you, Jason. As you mentioned, Elizabeth Rhodenizer, CIO at the Public Service Commission. Our organization is a central agency for the federal government, focused on a merit-based and nonpartisan public service. Some of our biggest business lines, if you will, are recruitment for government as well as assessments. So, great question of where we started. Our cloud journey started about a year ago. And I like to say that we leaped into the cloud and luckily we landed. When we took our first steps into cloud applications and our cloud journey, it wasn't planned to go as quick as we did, but it was necessary given we were developing in legacy systems at the time. We still are, but for this one project. And we were unable to use our updated technology stack. In particular, we wanted to use container technology, and our developers already had almost an MVP developed at that point. So we would have lost all of our work if we were not able to leverage our container design, if you will. So we ended up going into the cloud relatively quickly, but I think that was for both of our designers and our employees, but also the business, when we could do a lift and shift at that point. And this was a new app, so just want to preface that because I totally agree with Alan. You do not want to lift and shift legacy. A new small app and platform that we could move within the frame of 1 to 2 hours. So right there, it was an acceleration of our cloud journey, quite honestly. But I think, you know, when you look at, and what I've learned from that just to date that I would share with others who haven't started yet, and it aligns with what Alan said, you know, when he talked about your cloud strategy. But first off, understand your organization's aspirations. What do they want to do? If it's your organization that is driving you to go to the cloud, it's really important to understand that. If it's the CIO driving you or your own organization driving to go, then again, that's different. So how you look at the organizational aspirations and align it to the business strategy is fundamental. Then you also want to evaluate your capacity, and that's something that we had to do quite quickly. We need the skills and resources to go to the cloud. You know, our people that have either done infrastructure and operations or application development in legacy, it is not a like for like application. So we want to know what those skills and resources that we have and what do we need. And also going to the cloud, and there's a lot of talk about financials and cost savings. It also takes finances and financial resources in order to go to the cloud. Whether you're procuring it, whether you're doing your cost assessments and evaluation for operating the cloud on your legacy, or going for contracting support. And finally, I think you really want to make sure you start on a project that you can achieve, but also provides business value, because that's going to be your flagship, both to your employees of what can happen and how rapid you can move in the cloud versus our legacy infrastructure, versus what you also want to show your business lines and your partners, the organization of the value that is important to them as well. So that's a bit about how we leaped into the cloud a year ago, but also the lessons learned that we've taken, and we're still on our journey, Jason, for sure.
Of course. Does the journey really ever end, I suppose? Thank you so much. Some amazing insight there, and both you and Alan, you know, both mentioned workloads. What specific apps you want to be moving to the cloud as well. So I'd like to come to you here, Dugald, and you know, ask, how do you determine the workloads that are best suited to actually go into the cloud?
Well, it's a good question, obviously. I think the easiest thing to do is to look at what the advantages are in the cloud that don't exist on-premise. And so that's where I would start. Obviously, on-premise infrastructure by its very nature, you're going to invest in it, you're going to create it, build it, and establish it all yourself. The cloud gives you the luxury of being able to use workloads and scale them up to the amount of effort and the amount of computing power that they need at a particular time. And so we look at certain workloads in my organization. As the Chief Information Officer at the Department of Justice Canada, I'm essentially a CIO for what's one of the largest law firms, the largest one in Canada, with several thousand lawyers working. A lot of the work that we do involves litigation, complex litigation files, sometimes class action lawsuits involving hundreds of thousands or millions of documents. The processes of litigation involve several steps where all of a sudden you might need a massive computing power. If we're doing discovery, machine-assisted discovery on millions of documents, we're going to need to use tools that read through those documents, use machine learning in order to narrow down the scope of what's relevant and what's not to a particular case. Those are great examples of workloads you might want to move to the cloud, because when you need the computing power as you go through that document review process, you have access to it. You can scale up the workloads, but then when you've gone past that stage and now you're, let's say, getting closer to trial, when you've whittled down your documents and you're looking only at a subset that you're going to introduce, you don't need as much computing power. Now the work turns over to sort of the key litigants, the counsel who are actually going to be in court. And that's a time when they're not going to rely on all of that power that you had in the cloud. And if you've worked out your contracts for cloud providers carefully, then you'll be able to actually pay for what you use rather than paying for all of the infrastructure you might need. So for other businesses, ones that, let's say, aren't doing obviously litigation work, I would say use a similar technique. There are always fits and starts to business processes. There are always times of the year that are busier. financial systems, for instance, are a good candidate to go to the cloud. When you get to your fiscal year end, you can scale up the power that you have to devote to your financial planning applications, and then scale it back. So I would, the bottom line is I would get back to what Elizabeth said earlier about finding the business value. To me, you look at the workloads based on the likelihood that you're going to have a workload where the amount of power you're going to need is going to vary over time. Concentrate on those. And secondly, look for examples where you might have a really legitimate use case for getting to the cloud. In our case, at the Department of Justice, we have approximately 1,400 counsel on our staff who are essentially acting as if they were in-house counsel in other departments, since departments like the Public Service Commission, where they provide legal expertise to those clients. Moving to the cloud allows us to create one single environment that all of our users have access to, regardless of how they connect. And so that's where we're going to get business value. It's looking at the type of work that's getting done. And when it comes to legal work, in our case, we want to make sure we can create one common environment that people can connect to, whether they're connecting from a headquarters office at the Department of Justice, one of our regional offices across the country, a departmental office like the Public Service Commission, where they're providing support through resources provided by Elizabeth and her team, or if they're in a courthouse, they get access to the exact same experience, the exact same set of tools. These are the types of business cases, I think, that make it worth moving to the cloud. They allow you to take advantage of things, even if you're not in an organization like we're not, that actually does a lot of aggressive software development and needs to take advantage, let's say, of modern cloud infrastructures for DevOps. That's not a concern for us, but we can still find a lot of legitimate uses for cloud-based architectures.
That's it. Thank you. Hakan, obviously somebody positioned in Canada, but with an organization with operations globally, right? I mean, is there a different approach to this when a private organization such as yourselves, for example, kind of gets out there and looks to try and take this journey that maybe is different to government, for example, or small and medium businesses that Alan has referenced?
Absolutely, yes. Thanks, Jason. My name is Hakan Kutluay. I'm the CIO of the Eldorado Gold Corporation. We are looking at this. Everything is just adding to Alan's and Elizabeth's and Duang's, and basically it is a strategy of the cloud, but how you do your strategy with the all globally, because you're operating different jurisdictions in the world. So I have to mention about a little bit on privacy and security part of the cloud. It was challenging for a company who operates earlier in China. We left China at the moment, but we operated in China, and we are in Europe, so which is consideration of GDPR, and of course we are in Canada too, and we are in Brazil. So those things are really being considered. And when you do that cloud strategy, it was maybe the first one was. So the second was the dependency of the applications. So when our experience, once you sit down and sort it out how the privacy and security part would be okay with each jurisdictions. Next was the application itself, how you're gonna move that applications to the cloud. And the first thing came to is dependency. So our journey was what I can suggest is the dependency map should be the on the table. For example, give you an example. If the application accounting piece on cloud and inventory piece has to stay on prem because of let's say some restrictions or some countries' regulations, that will make your job and cloud moving really complicated. So the first step I would say for anyone to go to cloud or 50% to go cloud, dependency map in whatever the application is running only cloud to move there would be the best choice. Then after make the complex to move out to the other pieces. So yes, the question you were saying, the different jurisdictions, different countries, different areas will make the cloud journey very challenging.
Fantastic, thank you. Obviously, you related a little bit to data privacy and security there as well, and I'd love to evolve the conversation now, looking into the data aspect of things. Coming back to you, Alan, actually, with respect to data, I mean, what do businesses and organizations kind of need to consider before moving to the cloud?
Data is always a huge concern, and that's where most of the risk lies. First thing is, what is your data hygiene? And what I mean by that is, organizations typically accumulate, they generate data, but they don't clean it up, they don't keep it current. So having a data retention policy, understanding what those requirements are, and then making sure that you get rid of the data that you don't want to bring to the cloud. Again, do the cleanup first. And then there are regulatory and compliance requirements. There's a lot of sensitive data that organizations produce, whether it's business intelligence, proprietary information. Regulations include FOIP, PI, PIPEDA, GDPR, that was mentioned earlier. And so those are all considerations when thinking about data and data in the cloud. What are your data residency requirements? What are you required to do from that perspective? What is the sensitivity of that particular data, and what is the risk to the organization if you happen to have that data compromised, whether through ransomware, theft, or loss? So those are some of the things that we help our customers understand. What are all their digital assets? What is the information, the importance and sensitivity of that information? And then what cloud do we put that in? Because not every cloud is the same. And that is extremely important to protect the assets that you have. We're seeing such a huge increase in cybersecurity incidents as a result of people working remotely today, more so than before COVID hit. The number of ransomware attacks are significant, and it's because people have moved to the cloud hastily and haven't considered everything around safeguarding the assets and the business intelligence that they have.
Great. You bring up interoperability there, obviously important with a multi-cloud strategy here, and I'd love to get your perspective here, Dugald, on I suppose multi-cloud can help in so many different ways, right? But then from a security aspect, more things to consider, right? So I mean, is it important to use multiple cloud vendors when embarking on your journey or creating a strategy around this, or can it all kind of been done, within one cloud environment?
So what I would say is, of course, the first step is always to assess the information and the data that you have, because not all information needs to be treated with the same level of attention and level of protection. And so in the federal government, obviously, we have a pretty consistent standard that we have to apply in terms of whether information is protected or classified, and then at exactly what level. And we have security controls that we deploy. But I think it's important to realize in the public sector as well as in the private sector, everyone is responsible for security. And I'm very conscious of Alan's comments, because we've seen a lot of egregious examples lately of people moving quickly to the cloud and not taking the time to actually secure their cloud infrastructure properly. And of course, even though the major cloud vendors invest hundreds of millions of dollars in security, it only works if you actually apply the appropriate security controls on your side to make it work effectively. So getting back to your question, as far as multi-vendors, if you have information that you really want to keep secure, or if you have concerns about the cloud, this is something that comes up often in the legal context, because of course law firms are often responsible for the information of many different client organizations, and they have to take steps to make sure that it remains secure. The legal domain is relatively risk averse, and they do tend to stick with solutions for a very long time. And so one of the options that comes up when it comes to multi-cloud is to make sure you separate your data and your encryption keys. It's no secret that encryption is the key to security in the cyber world these days. And so if you have one cloud vendor that has access to the encryption keys and a separate cloud vendor that is actually storing your data, it's a simple solution to make sure that no one except your own organization has access to both sides and therefore has access to your information. Your original question, though, was, do you need to go to multi-vendors? And I would come back to it by saying no. Again, start with what the information is. How important is it for you to protect it? If you have, let's say, the recipe to the KFC chicken or to the original Coca-Cola, obviously that's not something that you're going to just distribute freely with one cloud vendor, but a great deal of corporate information could go onto a single vendor's cloud systems, cloud infrastructure, so long as you understand what their security controls are and you put in place on your side the appropriate security controls to make it work. So I would say multi-cloud vendors is not necessary, certainly not a requirement for a smaller organization. But when you come to a scale the size of the federal government, obviously we have multiple reasons why we'd want to use more than one cloud vendor. If nothing else, it's to separate our procurements out and make sure that we're giving the market an equal chance to compete. And so I'd say it's definitely an option worth considering. And if you configure things correctly, you actually have the option, if you try and make yourself, if you put yourself in a position where you avoid vendor lock-in, then you can take advantage of sales, move information from place to place. And so my final recommendation, I guess, to others would be to be creative in how you go about these things. I mentioned earlier the prospect of some of these litigation files we have that involve gigabytes or even terabytes of information. We often need to maintain copies of that information for a very long time. And so it's not complicated to encrypt it before storing it. Then you can take advantage of cloud vendors, whichever happen to be the cheapest. But because you only store encrypted information in the cloud, you can rely on it as being a secure enough approach for the information you need to protect. So the key, in my opinion, is versatility. I would say you don't have to have multiple cloud vendors, but you definitely want to make sure that you're in a position where you can escape, so to speak, from one if you've gotten locked down and the prices have started to go up. And also, if you have particularly sensitive information, the crown jewels of your business, for instance, that's a situation where you want to consider very strongly the possibility of separating the data itself from the encryption keys used to store and encrypt that information.
Alan, anything you'd like to add to that in response?
Simply, I absolutely agree with what Dugald has said. But in terms of cloud providers, my recommendation is to pick a proven platform. There are multiple platforms out there that are less secure than others. They are cloud-based, absolutely they are. But if you stick with the known providers, you get the assurance from third-party auditors that your data is going to be more secure, that their controls, the cloud providers' controls, are adequate for the risk appetite that you have as an organization. Things like Amazon Web Services, Google, and Azure, they have consumer-grade cloud services and they have business-grade. Go with the business-grade, go with the proven platforms, avoid the risk where you can avoid the risk, where it makes sense for your business.
Great, thank you so much. Elizabeth, I would love to get your perspective on hybrid. We've spoken here about multi-cloud strategies, right? Obviously, a lot of people looking at hybrid strategies. We're having 50% on-prem as well. What are the security concerns with a hybrid strategy, and also the interoperability concerns as well, to make sure that you have access to that data as readily as you would in the cloud, and again, that information is going to be secure?
So I think for us, Jason, right now that we're still, like I mentioned before, we're still in early days, even though it's been over a year now on our journey. This is a preoccupation for us. And I don't see many organizations going all cloud. Very, very few. In government, I think we know of one because it was a brand new organization. They had the opportunity. But for many of us, we are still running operations on legacy systems. So we have to prepare for hybrid solutions. When we're looking at, and there's other things that when you do decide, and we talked about some of them, but when you're taking an application to the cloud, especially if it's a critical business function, you have to look at what legacy, and as Hakan said before, almost your dependency maps as well, but what traffic has to go back to our legacy operations and systems, and where is the integration there? For us, it's very much, as I mentioned before, we do recruitment, we do assessment, and we have integration of those legacy systems on the back end. So as we move more and more to the cloud, we have to look at that. So it's ensuring that APIs, the use of APIs is possible, and that the standards are followed when it comes to that. And when it looks at, we also look at security. We, to both what Dugald and Alan said, we need to ensure in that cloud environment the security guardrails are in place. And for the Government of Canada, we have an extensive guardrail cookbook, if you will, that's already in place, where some of our key leaders in both security and service provision have laid this out. So each of us as departments will work with our cloud providers and ensuring in the terms and conditions that this is all going to work as we have to for government policy and regulations, but also for what we need on the security level and assurance.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Hakan, Elizabeth spoke there about legacy systems. Obviously, we know that as CIOs, you're dealing with multiple technologies, right? Multiple different systems. It's not just all about cloud. And what I suppose I'd love to find out and ask is, are there similar risks involved? So, I mean, you know, the risks associated with cloud computing, are they different from traditional technology delivery models? And if so, how do you assess those risks?
Right, yeah. I'd like to start with Alan's when he mentioned about known technology, known provider areas when they provide you solid solutions plus security side of it. That's I agree. I completely agree with that. But at the same time, I like to mention about the small cloud. What is the advantage of having the small cloud providers, which is they can be more flexible. For example, give you an example of AWS, Microsoft, IBM won't be able to change their MSA or SLAs because of your 2,000 or 4,000 users. They won't change that. They would be changing their agreement, maybe bigger customers like federal government or 100,000 users. Now you're able to make the change. So I also like to work with the smaller cloud providers because of that. Then they can shape it around with your needs and your legal needs. Because when we talked about earlier workload, I find out on CIOs after the cloud on the table, we actually may be getting a less considerations on or less work on infrastructure and software side of it, but we get more and more every day dealing with the other companies and third parties and cloud providers and talking with legals and lawyers and getting the right and shaped and agreement in place, and it helps IT and helps with the company. So that's why it actually workload a little bit shift to a different part of it. It's not less work, it just shift work to me. And speaking of the mining, actually, if you look at mining, we are not in the center of the city. We are middle of nowhere. We have actually challenges with the internet connections, and we have to have a stable connections to make that connection to the cloud. And what we find out is the connections in 10 years ago was really challenging. Today is not. It's not like that. And the cloud technologies, they are providing a really good, they don't really need a huge bandwidth to work with on the applications. Of course, when we are in the middle of nowhere, we have to look at the applications, how much of the bandwidth is just required for that. And they're really getting better and better. Legacy, yes, you need to have the legacies in place. At the same time, Jason, we are looking at every softwares in the market, and if you look at it, everybody on those vendors, they're looking at the cloud solutions and cloud platforms for themselves. So the next version of anything will be cloud anyway. So even the CIOs, and we want to have that on-prem because of not IT, maybe the company required or regulations required to be on-prem. It won't exist because the software won't be on-prem. It will be always on cloud. So that is going there. So the companies to be, and we all need to find a comfort level how that will be ending on cloud.
Right. Alan, coming back to you here as well. When we talk about risk, big theme here that we've spoken about is security, understandably. I can imagine in the instance of the government of Canada, you're dealing with public information, very, very, very sensitive. If you're a small organization, you may not necessarily have the capabilities of putting in place, sophisticated security, firewalls, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Is the risk of data leaking, being exposed to the wrong people, is that the biggest risk assessment people have to consider when embarking on the journey into the cloud or making that decision to kind of move into the cloud?
It depends on the business value of your data and the sensitivity of that data. It was Dugald who talked about being in the legal vertical for the government, and I completely agree. When you think about the data and the risk to your data, if that data is lost or compromised in any way, if you cannot get access to it, what does that do for your business? What we have found out is that most small and medium businesses, after a data compromise, whether it's a ransomware or theft, most of those businesses struggle to reopen within the first 3 months after a data breach, and nearly 70% close after the first year. They just cannot sustain operations. So I understand Hakan's assessment of the small cloud providers, and I agree they offer excellent choices in a software as a service model for things like HR and marketing, finance and accounting, et cetera. But think of the crown jewels that you have as a business and protect those crown jewels as much as possible. Be as risk adverse as you can, or you risk not being business anymore. Data is it's modern currency. It's today's currency, and that's my advice to small and medium businesses, and even to enterprises as well. That's where your money is.
That's great. That's a nice segue, really, to kind of round this conversation out as well. What I'd love to do is get the perspective of each of you on what people risk not moving to the cloud. Then, we've spoken about obviously the risks and the risk assessment of moving to the cloud, and the challenges those pose. But what challenge do people encounter if they, like many in Canada are doing right now, are sitting tight and not necessarily making those moves or beginning that journey? Elizabeth, I'd love to start with you and just get your own professional opinion on what these companies risk missing out on, both from an organizational perspective and beyond.
So I think with this question, Jason, I wouldn't even advise anybody to not start making their journey. If they haven't started their journey, then they should, to whatever extent they can and whatever resources they can, but even to start taking the lens of their business and their business strategy of what that is. I think Hakan said it really, really wonderfully, where we're going to get to a point where people aren't going to have the option for on-prem anymore. So I don't think this is a question of, should I consider going to the cloud? It's each of us have to consider how we're going to go to the cloud and how our journey is going to unfold. And I think that's fundamental. And in order to do that, you need to, as I mentioned before, to look at the business strategy and the aspirations, but you also need to look at the people and your people internally as well. You need talent who can help guide and actually deliver on this. For the federal government, for both Dugald and I, we have a shared service provider. So a lot of these skills about 8 years ago or so went over to a shared service provider. So now we are looking to rebuild capacity and attract talent within our teams to help us on this journey, because we cannot do it alone. So I think it's great time right now where we are at that point. I'm not sure as the demand increases what's going to happen to our overall talent pool for digital and technical expertise in this area, because we already know there's not enough supply of this talent to meet the demand. So as we go more and more in the niche of cloud and it picks up, if you don't start today, how are you going to survive tomorrow? I think that's the question we all have to ask ourselves.
Very poignant. You've got somebody where we're talking about if you don't move into the cloud, your business isn't going to be here. But going to Alan's point, before you move to the cloud, make sure you put all the parameters in place. Otherwise, your business isn't going to be here. So there's a lot to consider there. Dugald, would love to get your thought. Advice to any CIOs out there who are still a little bit hesitant towards this. I mean, what would you say to them?
Well, I guess I would say two things. I mean, at first, I would say don't be surprised if you're already in the cloud and you're just not aware of it. I've obviously found it funny. Being in IT for a very long time, the cloud became something that CEOs and in our case, deputy ministers started hearing about and talking about. long after it already existed. And in our case at the Department of Justice, we had a library circulation desk system that was delivered as software as a service out of California. We also had our HR group using things like survey tools, Fluid Survey, later purchased by SurveyMonkey. All of these things were already in place. And obviously, I'm sure a lot of us have run into the odd Prezi presentation here and there, because people love adopting the latest and greatest cloud tool. So getting back to Hakan's point, the fact of the matter is, it's not necessarily the case that you won't be able to find applications that deliver to you on premise if you want them. I think some of those will still exist, but you have to ask yourself, do you want to start using applications provided by businesses that haven't yet converted to delivering through the cloud? And are those businesses likely to be at the leading edge of their respective space? I think the answer is probably going to be no. And so my advice to CIOs would be, make sure that you don't already have pockets of cloud that you weren't aware of, and be honest in assessing the risk of those. And when you look to upgrade, innovate, or change as you move forward, whether it's building your own applications, you're going to want to leverage the power of cloud infrastructure and platform as a service in order to build quickly. If you don't want to build and you want to use some new application, the killer app that fits perfectly into what your business needs to get to the next level, I'm pretty sure that killer app is going to be designed by a company that's building in the cloud and not necessarily building an on-premise solution. So essentially, you have no choice. I think you're going to have to move to the cloud.
Great. Hakan, same question to you.
Yes.
I mean, what advice do you give to those?
Sure. Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, I like the crowd here to being, public sector and a publicly traded company as well as Eldorado Gold in here, because we are mining company, so we are there for us, whatever the mining life is. Please look at, you gotta look at the situation sometimes. Okay, I am gonna be building a mine there, and there will be a life of the mine. It's not gonna be forever. So if we need to have a solution, you need a solution today. So we need to consider those ones and put the systems in place. Whatever we need it now. When you do that, of course, you're looking at the long term, but when you do that, you also consider your users. So we are responsible for our board of directors and all the executives, and also we're responsible for looking at our users. When I say that, successful IT and CIOs, when you look at we have to look at our users. To our workforce is it's the new generation. If you look at the new generation, and my geologist on the field, that's what I wanted to give an example of the mining. My geologist at the field, he's coming from a world of cloud technologies, cloud apps, and we all know those ones. And when you go back and tell them to connect and to do their work, to connect to work, let's say VPN or other technologies, because of more secure we think it is, and it doesn't work. So we gotta really respond promptly. Those workforces, they're coming from the new generation, and new generation is already running on apps. So I would say it's the for the future of that, it's security, yes, security for sure, looking at it, and also workforce, and they are ready for cloud. Then we don't have to really go through, because they're already there.
That's it, thank you. And final thought of the day, I'll come back to you, Alan. We opened up with yourself, and I'd love to close with yourself then. So, as a virtual CIO for Ricoh there, you're advising and guiding folks along this journey all the way. I mean, just give us a little bit of a flavor as to how you guys can help people along this path, especially that start that we focused on a lot, and
Sure.
how Ricoh are a place to help.
Sure. So thank you for that. We help organizations understand where they are on their digital transformation maturity cycle. It takes companies, some of them, a great deal of time to go from legacy apps and paper-based and manual processes to the kinds of automation that's available in the cloud, and the kinds of elasticity and cost benefit that's there. Legacy apps are probably the worst ones to try and move to the cloud because it takes time to develop them. It takes time to redo the security model from that on-prem, castles and moats thought process to more of a hotel style, with a key that gets you onto different floors and rooms. That's the cloud model from a cybersecurity perspective. So, we help people understand where they are in that digital transformation journey. I always advise our customers to use commercial off-the-shelf platforms and don't customize your applications as much as possible. Train people, don't customize. The mantra is no customization without differentiation. So if it's not going to help you sell more things, if it's not going to help you be a better business or provide better service, don't customize. Train people to use it. I like what Hakan said about bringing that consumer experience to the workplace today. These generations that are coming up are used to using apps all the time, and they don't customize those apps. They just use them and they lever them to their greatest advantage. We went through a period in IT of moving from standalone systems to virtualizing systems so that we could get better usage out of the investments that we made. Cloud computing makes things even more efficient with greater security. It's not a matter of if you're going to get hacked, it's a matter of when. And so, the old adage of security through obscurity, hiding, isn't going to work anymore. You need to be risk aware. You need to know what your crown jewels are. You need to know how to protect those. There's a lot of thoughts there, but those are the kinds of things that I advise our customers. Those are the kinds of things we can help our customers with. Just one last thought in terms of the question you had was, what are you going to miss if you don't move to the cloud? For many small and medium businesses, to be able to compete means they need enterprise-grade tools and technology and speed of access that enterprises have. Otherwise, they can't compete with them. Software as a service and things like e-discovery, hosted e-discovery, and I know Dugald is familiar with that. These are tools that small and medium businesses can lease for a short-term basis to provide them that competitive advantage so they can compete with larger organizations. That is one of the advantages to moving to the cloud that most organizations will miss if they don't go there.
Thank you. Great. Thank you for adding that. Well, thank you very much, each of you, for your insight and perspective today. It's been extremely valuable. And thank you, everyone, for joining and viewing this webinar. I would like to encourage you to reach out to the folks at Ricoh if you're embarking on this journey or you're looking for a little bit of assistance while you're in the middle of this journey itself. Reach out to the folks at Ricoh and they'll be on hand to assist. If you're interested in viewing additional SINC webinars, feel free to check out our webinars page on our website for more on-demand content. In the meantime, thank you again for joining us, panelists. Thank you again for joining us, audience, today. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll be back with you soon with another SINC webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Take care. Stay safe.